Really excited for our next guest, and really needs no introduction. But for everyone who's listening here, he is a historian and an author about the American West. You may have heard of two of his books, Coyote America and American Serengeti. He's also an A.B. Hammond Professor Emeritus of Western History in the University of Montana-Missoula. He's coming to us from one of his homes in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He is Dan Flores. Dan, like we said, just a pleasure to have you here with us. How are you doing today?
It's a beautiful day in Santa Fe County, so I'm doing pretty well. Thanks.
Of course. Stephen and I were talking. You've been on so many different talks and podcasts and things like that. And I'm sure you've probably gotten this question before, but for us and the people who are listening with us, just give everybody a little bit of your background and where, I guess your childhood experiences sort of influence either your perception of predators or like what got you into wanting to know more about the American West specifically and how that sort of played into, your career going forward.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I'm not a Westerner by birth. I was born in Louisiana. My family's an old Louisiana family that goes back into the early 1700s. So we were kind of on the edge of the West. And I think one of the reasons that I grew up fascinated with the West, I mean, there were two or three reasons, but one was that I had ancestors who were traders to the native tribes on the Southern Plains. And so we sort of had these stories in my family about some of our ancestors 3 or 4 or 5 generations back who had done this and gone west into the Red River, the upper Red River country. And this is the Red River of the South, by the way. It's the Red River that separates today Oklahoma and Texas. And when I was about 4 or 5 years old, my family went on a vacation to the Southwest, and we went to New Mexico and drove through a lot of the Southwest. And although I didn't remember that trip very much later in my life, I sort of dreamed about Western settings and blue skies with cotton ball clouds and red cliffs and things. I thought maybe as a kid I'd, stumble across some National Geo article on the West and had absorbed those images there and found out at a family reunion many years later, an aunt told me that, well, don't you think maybe this had something to do about with when we took you on that vacation when you were 5? Oh yeah, that must have been it. So yeah, so I was fascinated by the West from a variety of different angles. But as for the predator thing, I think what really got me excited and interested in predators was being a kid growing up in Louisiana, and at the age of about 12 or 13 or 14 years old, discovering that coyotes, which of course, like everybody else, I thought of as a Western animal. I watched the Roadrunner Coyote cartoons, and I could see the setting that Wile E. Coyote was in. It was clearly a Western setting. And suddenly here these animals were showing up in Louisiana. And I mean, as a 13-year-old, I engaged in a correspondence with Louisiana Parks and Wildlife, asking them why this was happening and what these animals were first, because the first ones I saw, I thought probably were wolves. So
Wow.
this was kind of really intriguing to me. Why were coyotes moving out of the West into a place like Louisiana? And that got me intrigued enough that I think I always had in my mind that one of these days I was going to write a book about the whole coyote story. It took me quite a while to get to it, but I eventually did that.
That's incredible.
For you, what is it about writing and educating others that you were able to translate from your personal experiences? Why was that such an important thing for you to do later on, to write these books, to educate folks, and to give them the information that you've collected over the years so that others can put that onto the world?
Yeah, that's obviously a good question to ask of anyone who writes, especially who's written as much as I have throughout my life. I kind of grew up in a small town where we didn't even have enough kids to make up one baseball team, let alone two to play one another. So I would spend summers, a lot of my summers, when I wasn't outside doing things, I spent reading. And so had a fascination with writing and with authors, and sort of from an early age knew that being a writer was one of the things I wanted to do. And the first expression of that really happened when I was still actually an undergraduate in college. I sold a magazine article to a national magazine, and um, for about 4 or 5 years before I went on to graduate school, I basically wrote for magazines as a freelancer and in a couple of instances as a columnist. And so I had this fairly early preparation, um, schooled by editors at magazines like Field and Stream and Outdoor Life, that the audience you were writing for was really critical, and that whenever you wrote these kinds of pieces, you needed to constantly be thinking about who the audience was and how you could appeal to them. So I think that probably influenced most of my work throughout my career. I mean, I went on to get a PhD in environmental history, and was a professor for nearly 35 years, and primarily wrote books about history during those years. But I never did lose this idea about writing for popular audiences, which I continue to do throughout my academic career. And I kind of have turned to that full time now that I've retired from university life.
Do you remember the first handful of papers you wrote or articles?
Well, the first ones I wrote were about white-tailed deer in the South, and I had an editor. I still remember the guy's name. His name was David Petzel, who was an acquisition editor at Sports Afield magazine, and he was one of those kinds of guys who was sort of on the lookout for people he thought might have some kind of future in writing, and he encouraged me to send him things that he edited for the magazine. And so I was writing early on about corvids, about white-tailed deer, about ultimately when I started going out to the West, about animals like pronghorns. And I finally began doing for Louisiana magazine called Louisiana Woods and Waters. I began to do a conservation column because I was always interested in the conservation story of how we had managed to barely rescue so many species from a 19th century experience that had come close to wiping out a lot of North America's native animals, and did, of course, extinguish some of them, like passenger pigeons, for example. And so I was interested in doing conservation stuff, and began doing that fairly early on, probably by about 1973 or 74. So that's why when I went on to graduate school and got a PhD, what I was interested in was the history of the relationship between people and the natural world, what was then being called environmental history.
So you were writing a lot about species that are commonly considered game species or hunted species, and the human relationship to those species. So I assume you had and were developing a perspective of hunting in a general sense. How has that kind of evolved over time?
Well, I mean, as a kid growing up in a state that, labeled itself a sportsman's paradise, which is how the Louisiana license plates always read. I mean, I grew up in a rural setting, and so one of the things I did was hunt and fish. And I mean, I didn't continue that for a lot of my growing up years. By the time I was about 20 or so, and in college, I sort of gave all that up. But I had grown up doing it, and that was my entree into being fascinated with wildlife, with animals. And of course, as I said, I spent a lot of time reading too. And I early on found a number of authors, Ernest Thompson Seton, for example, who wrote about wildlife and about animals. Seton was a turn of the 20th century nature writer who wrote several really famous books. Wild Animals I Have Known, Lives of Game Animals. And so I discovered his stuff, and began kind of focusing in a lot of my work on the natural history. And as I began to progressed farther in my education, ultimately the ecology of some of the animals that I was intrigued by. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I mean, one of the early ones was the coyote, because that was kind of like rounding a corner on Bourbon Street in New Orleans and confronting a moose. I mean, it's one of those things you just didn't expect in Louisiana. And that sort of unexpected marvel was one of the things that got me interested in those animals.
Wow. I I want to get into this because you mentioned coyotes a few times, and I told you before we began recording, I just finished your book, and it really struck me. There were so many different through lines that interested me, and where I want to begin is really about the characteristics of coyotes and why. Well, like when you were doing your research and all the experiences you had, what's something you can draw on that people can understand why coyotes early on were appealing to native populations and why they were really so much in their folklore, their mythology. They were deities a little bit in there
Yeah,
in some of
yeah.
their storytelling. What was it about them that drew the indigenous folks of North America towards the coyote to put them in important places in their stories?
The the coyote with a capital C, which is the semi-deity figure in native lore, is the primary character in North America's oldest preserved literature. Those coyote stories from all the Western tribes, every group of native people who were in the region that coyotes inhabited, which in the beginning was west of the Mississippi River before they began to move out of that part of the world, they came to a kind of a fascination with those animals and began telling stories about them. No telling how far back in the past, but I think it may have been as far back as 10,000 years. So, I mean, I have a chapter in Coyote America titled Old Man America, and it's about Coyote with a capital C, this semi-deity figure, who, as I said, is our oldest literary figure. I mean, Tom Sawyer and Huck Twain don't hold a candle to Coyote, who is thousands and thousands of years older and whose stories were told orally, so they were passed down from generation to generation. As for why the native people picked this particular animal, I mean, I argue in that book that there likely were two or three reasons. For one thing, native people, I think, were on the scene. I know they were at a time when North America was losing so many creatures out of the Pleistocene. I mean, we were losing woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths, and we were losing animals like dire wolves, this very impressive, very large North American wolf that disappeared about 10,000 years ago in North America. But the coyote, almost alone, along with a handful of other animals like bison and like pronghorns and elk and so forth, the coyote was one of the ones that survived this extinction scenario. And I think as native people observed that, one of the things that occurred to them was that the coyote was by no means the largest of the survivors. He was not the most vicious of the survivors because wolves, gray wolves, red wolves, eastern wolves all survived the extinction scenario too. But I think what really caught their attention was that coyotes were surviving by their wits. They were doing so by being intelligent. And that's, of course, the secret to humanity's survival down through the ages. We have managed to arrive at our present domination of the planet by being smart, by really being intelligent and learning how to manipulate the world. And I think people saw the coyote as kind of an avatar, as a stand-in for humanity in the world. And so they began to observe coyotes really closely, how they managed to pull off their survival and their really remarkable strategies as they go about their lives. And out of that came this body of oral literature where coyote is cast as, for one thing, he's a Paleolithic deity. So he's not even like a corn god or something, or a god of wheat from the Neolithic Revolution. This is a deity that goes back before we began to domesticate plants and animals. So it's a really, really old God figure. And he's also, unlike, say, a Jesus of Nazareth, who presents the guise of being this perfect individual to which humans aspire. That kind of perfection is what we're supposed to strive for. Coyote is a deity figure who preserves all of the traits of humanity, both the good qualities and the bad qualities. And a lot of the stories, the funniest ones, and usually the most instructive ones, are about Coyote's bad traits. And out of that, of course, we have, and this is the last thing I'll say before we move on, but about Coyote, what you should know is that we've long referred to him as a trickster figure. I argue in Coyote America and some of my other work that we've kind of missed the point about these stories, although they sometimes do involve a trick. It's often Coyote who has the trick played on him. And the reason he falls for the trick in almost every instance in these stories is because of some particular trait in human nature. And so what the stories really are about is they're about human nature and why we tend to fall for certain kinds of things in the world and not others. That, of course, makes them a very valuable body of stories.
Is incredible. And you mentioned their strategies and how those were observed and sort of studied. How do you define the strategy of a coyote, the coyote strategy of staying alive, of surviving?
Well, for one thing, the coyote is always on the move. I mean, I love the fact that almost all the native stories about him start with the same phrase: "Coyote was going along." He's always moving, and as he's going along, he usually, and this is often a reference in the stories as well, he gives the observer this kind of sharp-eyed momentary glance, and that, of course, is a characteristic coyote trait.
Yeah,
Coyote is he's a kind of a character who has learned through his cultural preparation how to survive around humans. I mean, that's another feature of the coyote story, is that they have, I mean, we today think of them, okay, coyotes have invaded our cities. They've invaded Chicago, they've invaded Denver, they've invaded Los Angeles. The truth, of course, is that, for one thing, coyotes were here to start with. But for another thing, coyotes have been hanging around people from the very beginning of human arrival in North America. Coyotes have been here in their present form for about 1 million years. And we only got here roughly 23,000 years ago, at least at the present way of estimating it. So coyotes immediately were attracted to us. And one of the reasons I think they were is because their primary prey are rodents, rats, and mice. And of course, one of the things that happens when humans set up camps and villages and cities and houses is that we attract mice and rats.
Right.
And so coyotes tend to hang around us. And they've been doing that forever. And that's why they're so good at it.
There was one point too that I loved in here about coyotes' characteristics before we move on, is you mentioned in there that there is this good undertone of coyote, almost like there's this trickster model, there's all the other things that you said, but underneath coyote, like there is a good about him that it sort of has to play itself out in order for it to be shown. It's sort of hidden behind all of these barriers. What can you say about that? Just knowing that underneath all the other stuff, coyote in and of itself typically is good in some ways.
Well, I will say there are a lot of ways to approach that question, and one way to do so is to just take a look at the very first science that American ecologists produced about coyotes. The Murray brothers in the 1930s and 1940s were, and this is kind of remarkable because we had already passed a federal law to try to exterminate coyotes in North America before we actually had any scientists do any scientific work on them to see what role they played in the world. But the Murray brothers, Olaus and Adolf, in the 1930s and 1940s, did some of the first scientific work on coyotes. And one of the things that Olafsbury in particular pointed out was that when he examined the stomach contents of the coyotes he was studying, and this was in the vicinity of Grand Teton Jackson National Park, Jackson Hole, his argument was that as far as he could tell from what coyotes ate, about 90%, 85 to 90% of what they did in the world was beneficial for humans because they were preying on animals that were actually a problem for ranchers and farmers in terms of being pests. And rodents, of course, were one of those. But the scientific evidence indicates that coyotes generally, rather than being this sort of, demon-like character out in nature that so much of our history has tried to portray them, they actually function beneficially on the part of humans. And another way to answer that question is to cite the work of some of the biologists like Stan Gert, for example, in Chicago, who have been studying coyotes in urban settings for the last 30 or so years. And the work done there tends to portray coyotes about at this kind of percentage. About 95% of urban coyotes are good citizens. They don't get in trouble. They do all the beneficial things that coyotes do on behalf of people. They don't get noticed very often. They basically are good citizens. But at about the same rate that humanity shows that there's a small percentage of us who get in trouble in life, coyotes are individualistic, and there will be 3 or 4% of the animals who, for whatever the reason, get into trouble. They start, for example, attacking cats, or they start doing other things that cause them to attract attention. And those are the troublesome coyotes that animal damage control people often will try to remove from a population. But these are animals that basically do good in the world. And that's a striking thing to say, since we Americans, bringing our old world folklore traditions with us from Europe to America, and those traditions went back to 8,000 years of having domesticated animals like sheep and goats and hogs and chickens, so that we always sort of regarded predators as the mortal enemy of that domesticated livestock lifestyle. We come to North America, have never seen coyotes before, don't have any idea what role they play in the world, but immediately come to the conclusion that because the coyote is kind of a small junior wolf, it has to be this demon-like figure in the world, and we need to get rid of it at all costs. And so, as I mentioned to start this off, before we ever do any science on coyotes, we decide that we're going to try to exterminate them in North America, just like Europeans exterminated wolves in most of the countries of Western Europe.
So what time period, as far as you can tell, is it that the curiosity and sort of admiration that you were talking about just a few minutes ago morphs into kind of a consistent villain narrative, or we're both always there in tandem, I guess?
Yeah, well, I tried to track that as well as I could in Coyote America and came up with quite a few references in the period from roughly the time of Lewis and Clark, who call the animal, by the way, they don't know the southwestern name for the coyote. That comes from the Aztecs, actually. And so they named the coyote the prairie wolf. And that's sort of the name it's known by, at least until the 1870s, until Mark Twain publishes Roughing It and apprises Americans that the animal is properly called a coyote. And he says that's how it's pronounced, too. But in the period between Lewis and Clark and the time you get to Mark Twain, there are a lot of pretty ambiguous reactions to the animals by people who go west and see them for the first time and don't really know exactly what to think of them. They look like wolves, but they're considerably smaller and therefore less dangerous, presumably, and less likely to be a threat to large animals like cattle. And so there's kind of an ambivalent sort of reaction to them by most people in the period of the middle of the 19th century. But after Mark Twain publishes Roughing It in 1873, and includes about a 5-page passage on the coyotes that he sees on the overland trails and in places like Nevada, I mean, we began to change our attitudes very quickly. I mean, and what Twain is trying to do, not to, cast aspersions on Mark Twain. I love the guy and I love his writing, but he's a humorist. And so he's got an animal out here that he knows most Americans have never seen or heard of, and they don't know what to make of it. And so he gives us a way to think of it, and he calls it a living, breathing allegory of want. He says it'll eat anything on the roadside, that it's such a sorry skeleton and bag of bones that he says a flea would jump off a coyote and jump onto a velocipede or a centipede in preference to being on a coyote. I mean, he gets warmed up, and of course, he goes on for pages with this. And so it's really funny, but it casts coyotes in a really bad light. And as I looked at the literature that followed Twain's book, what I began to realize is that starting in the 1870s, and American writers are just competing with one another to try to come up with the most despicable characterization of the coyote you can, until we finally got to the 1920s, when a writer, and of all places, Scientific American, wrote a piece where he said that the coyote was not worth the ammunition that you would expend to shoot him dead, but you should shoot every coyote you saw because it was a patriotic act to do so. And the reason it was a patriotic act, he says, is because the coyote, after all, is the original Bolshevik, the original communist. I mean, this is right in the wake of the Russian Revolution. And so everything bad now suddenly is a communist. And so this writer labels the coyote a communist animal in America, which we need to get rid of. So it's kind of a crazy sort of roller coaster arc where you start with an animal that's regarded as a semi-deity by Native people. And by the 1920s, we're at a point where we're supposed to shoot them on sight. So that's the sort of arc that the coyote story follows up until about 100 years or so ago.
Wow. And of course, literature at the time being the only medium to sort of learn about things that you hadn't experienced personally, it would have had major tangible impact.
Yeah, there's no doubt it did. And, and another piece of literature that I should mention that comes out of sort of at the beginning, in fact, it's in 1900 in Scribner's Magazine, Ernest Thompson Seton writes a piece wherein he's trying to explain for readers of Scribner's Magazine why bison have almost disappeared, why pronghorn antelope have almost disappeared, why passenger pigeons are about to go extinct, why hardly anyone has seen an ivory-billed woodpecker in decades, why, I mean, just on and on and on. And yet, for all the efforts that people are going to try to wipe coyotes out, they're running them with dogs, they're trapping them, they're setting out strychnine poisoning attempts for them, and yet the animals are surviving. So Seton writes this piece in Scribner's called Tito, the Story of the Little Coyote Who Learned How. And what that story is an allegorical attempt by a nature writer who kind of doesn't have a scientific explanation yet for why coyotes are surviving when everything else is disappearing. And Seton writes a story about a coyote pup that's captured and chained up in a rancher's yard, whereas she grows up, she is able to observe all the different strategies that this livestock community is using to try to wipe out, as the article says, the coyote kind. So she observes them taking dogs out and preparing traps to set and preparing strychnine poison bait, on, until finally she manages to escape, goes into the wild, finds a mate, and has a litter of puppies who she then proceeds to teach all these strategies that humans are using to try to wipe out coyotes. And as Seaton says in his article, after this, generation after generation of coyote mothers train their pups in how to avoid being wiped out by humans. And he ends that piece with a very interesting kind of analogy. He says the best human analogy in human history is the story of Moses, a Jewish kid who is captured by the Egyptians who are preparing to destroy the population of Israel, and Moses learns what their plans are and escapes and goes and rescues his people. So these are the kind of stories that people are telling about these animals 100 years ago, trying to figure them out.
Yeah, and of course it's logical to identify literature, fables, and myths, shared around a campfire somewhere about predators as a good reason for the changes in human behavior over time. But do you feel that there is something fundamental or primal there that explains what seems to be a history of vilification of coyotes, wolves, cats, or is our primal instinct really to coexist and to consider them counterparts?
Yeah, those are really good avenues for exploration. And I did a lot with those kinds of things in my most recent book, Wild New World, where I really tried to come to terms with why in native traditions, coyotes are regarded as a semi-deity. Wolves are thought of as a totem animal that you model your behavior after and you learn from, and why old worlders arrive with a set of ideologies that are diametrically opposed to predators being allowed to survive anywhere. And there's no question that a part of that has to do with the old world domestication of animals and this 8,000 year folk tradition of protecting your flocks from and your herds from predators. Whereas in North America, I mean, the only domesticated animals that most North American groups had were dogs. Wild turkeys were domesticated by quite a number of groups, particularly those in the Southwest, as a ready source of protein. There was a duck species that was domesticated in Central America, but no ungulate domestications producing herds or flocks of animals that you have to protect against predators. And so those two traditions kind of give you a pretty clear expression of the idea that the anti-predator sentiment tends to come from an economic lifestyle. And when you don't have that particular lifestyle, you don't naturally develop a sentiment that causes you to hate predators. I mean, one of the reasons that I can argue something like that is that, of course, the truth is when you push history back far enough, when you push it back 20 to 25,000 or so years, which is when we think humans domesticated wolves to create our first animal companions. The reason we domesticate wolves, which obviously is a major predator, is because we find so much that we have in common with them. They live in groups, pack groups that are often about the same size as human hunter-gatherer groups. Wolves raise up their pups and acculturate them, teach them how to survive in the world, which is why little dog pups, I mean, they're pups till they're 2 years old, just like human infants are children until they're 12 or 14 or 15. It's that same principle among both social species that you have to train your young about how to function in the world. And of course, both groups, both humans and wolves, are primarily consumers of protein and meat eaters. And so the reason our first domesticated animals and our first animal companion is a wolf that we managed to domesticate into a dog is because of the close affinities that we have with these animals. And so it seems to me in order to get to the kind of hostility that old worlders had about predators and brought to North America, you have to make a big swing to some wholly new position that you're able to argue on behalf of, as opposed to native people who don't have to make a very big journey from domesticating wolves to thinking of wolves as totem animals and animals that you learn about the world from. So I think that the old worlders came through a really significant alteration in the way they thought of these kinds of animals over the last 8,000 or so years. And I think it's pretty well expressed in the fact that, I mean, by the time the British, for example, got to North America and began founding colonies in Massachusetts and Virginia and elsewhere, they hadn't been around wolves for more than 2.5 centuries. England had wiped out all its wolves by the 1400s. And so they come to North America, and most of those people, or almost all of them, are seeing wolves for the first time. And they're kind of shocked by that, by the prevalence of wolves. They have folklore traditions that tell them that wolves are going to eat them. And one of the things that I talk about at some length in Wild New World is the reaction on the part of these first Europeans on being among American wolves, which is, I mean, and this is from a early major work of natural history out of Massachusetts, published in 1630 by a guy named William Wood, who says, it has never been known yet that a wolf has set upon a man or a woman in these colonies. It just doesn't seem to happen. They go after our colts. They will sometimes go after hogs, but it's never been known that a wolf has set upon a man or a woman. So, I mean, it's a complicated story, which is why I devoted that amount of space to it. But I think it's an important thing to understand, because it gets us to a point where we can begin to see why there's such remnant hostility towards these animals even today.
Yeah, you talk about this too in Coyote America, and that's such a great explanation, Dan. This idea of value on a predator also, because this really ties into, well, if we can't exterminate, or while we're extirpating or trying to exterminate these species, and this ties into wolves and bison to a degree, is what is the monetary value we can get out of this as well. You go into that as also about the fur trade, and when did this shift happen, or when can you describe sort of like what was the idea surrounding saying, well, if we're killing all of these animals, why not use it for trade and things like that? Where did we go from hating everything or wanting everything to die and just sort of leave it to rot, to now use it as some form of monetary gain, which is, basically persisted for the better part of, a century and a half?
Yeah, I mean, I would say actually that the so-called market hunt is the very first act of old worlders arriving in North America. And again, this is, not to keep referencing Wild New World, but it's the book where I devote the most space to all this, because it's a book that's written about a whole suite of American animals, not just the predators like wolves or coyotes. But so Europeans, without putting too fine a point on it or going into the weeds too far, they bring with them, in addition to this predator hatred, two other things that are kind of critical that really will alter North America. I mean, we had 10,000 years of native occupation in North America, where, as far as I could tell, over that previous 10,000 years before Europeans arrived, and I'm talking about after the Pleistocene extinctions, I could find evidence of only one extinction that takes place in North America over the 10,000 years prior to the arrival of Europeans. But Europeans arrive with two really critical ideological notions. One is the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, which has taught them that humans are a separate being from all the rest of life. God made humans in the image of the deity itself, and because humans are made in the image of the deity, we are the only living things that have an everlasting soul and a promise of life after death. All the rest of life is basically put on the earth for our use. And along with that, by the way, went the idea that since God had created all of this in the beginning, it would never be altered. There's no such thing as extinction, because that would imply an imperfect world. And the creator obviously created a perfect world. The second ideological idea is the market-based economy, which is taking off at the time the old world nations are beginning to acquire colonies. I mean, one of the reasons they're interested in colonies is because of all the natural resources that are available now for an old world metropolis that has used up a lot of its trees, a lot of its resources. And so what the Americas provide is this tremendous storehouse of new natural resources. And one of those storehouses of natural resources are the furs of fur-bearing animals. So the very first Europeans who are sailing along America's shores, almost the first thing they write in their journals is that we have evidence from the native people of this animal, this animal, this animal, and this animal, and they're all going to be productive of very wonderful furs and leathers and things that we can sell back in the old world. So from the very beginning, the idea is we're going to go after beavers, we're going to go after otters, we're going to go after every kind of animal we can devise, white-tailed deer for the leather of their hides, because we need all these resources and there's a monetary value on all of them. And it's a market trade that, I mean, it's not just the Europeans who undertake it. They manage to snare America's native people into it. And the way they do that is by basically promising them a transformative technology. Old worlders, because they had been in a region of the world where Europe is connected to Asia, which is connected to the Middle East, which is connected to Africa, Europeans had gotten to be exposed to all the great inventions of all these civilizations. And one of those inventions, of course, had been the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age. And so Europeans had iron objects. They had metal arrow points to trade. They had metal swords to trade. They had metal farming implements to trade. And native people who had never gone through the Iron Revolution and ever reached the Iron Age are completely caught up in a trade for those objects. And what they have to trade are the furs of America's animals. So that market hunt starts basically as soon as Europeans arrive in the early 1600s. And it's not over until the United States finally, in the year 1900, begins to ban the interstate shipment of market source animal products from one state to another. So it goes for 300 years. And it's one of the things that wipes out so many of America's animals.
I'm curious what the scale of this market was. I mean, can you speak to that in terms of, I mean, I'm sure the amount of trappers engaging in this at any given time is too specific, but just the scale in general.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a figure, but what I can tell you is that it's this particular economy getting access to new populations of animals that have not yet been exploited is one of the things that drives, I mean, it had driven humanity's expansion out of Africa and around the world.
Right.
And now it drives settlement in America into one new frontier after another. And it's often young men who are fleeing the strictures of so-called civilized life and want to live out on the edges of the frontier who are engaged in it. I mean, it's difficult to say how many are involved at any one particular time. I mean, the classic fur trade, this is the economy that produces America's first millionaires. John Jacob Astor and the American Fur Company, that's the first American corporation, and he's the first American millionaire.
Really?
And it's based on the furs of all these animals from America. But at one point, he has about 15 trading posts across the West. They all employ 20 or 30 or 40 people. And then, of course, there are groups like the Rocky Mountain Fur Company that they just decide they're going to go out, and since what Astor is doing is having the native people do the procurement and bring the furs to his trading posts, which are kind of like the Walmarts or the Targets of the early 19th century, where you can stock up on goods and you can also trade your furs. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company just has what the people we call today the mountain men. They're going to go out, and they're just white American kids from the frontier who are going to go out and do the trapping themselves. And so this is this group of people that we tend to think of in kind of romantic terms as the Jim Bridgers and the Joe Meeks and the Hugh Glasses of the West, who go out and trap and marry Indian brides and sort of explore the early 19th century West. But what they're really doing is wiping out beavers all over the country. So this is really the story of the whole American experience with relationship to animals. And one of the things that I have argued in some of my work is take an animal like the passenger pigeon. They had been here for 15 million years. They had increased by the time Europeans were here.
Right.
In numbers that, we don't have a great way of estimating them, but it looks like somewhere between 5 and 10 billion passenger pigeons were in North America. They were the most numerous single bird species in America, and we think probably the most numerous single bird species on Earth. They'd been here for 15 million years. When we started hunting passenger pigeons for the market, they were unable to survive 300 years of our presence. In 300 years, we completely wiped them off the face of the earth. So, if you're looking for a poster kind of animal for this story I'm telling you, it's probably the passenger pigeon.
So during this 300-year span, were there any hunting regulations? Was that a concept that was thought of at the time?
Well, the United States government, the federal government, was so dedicated to the principle of laissez-faire, kind of an economic idea that governments don't interfere in capitalism, in economies. You just let economies go ahead and work, because economies are controlled by Adam Smith's higher laws, the law of supply and demand and all that. So the federal government doesn't lift a finger to control any of this market hunt. They don't lift a finger to stop the slaughter of bison in the West. They just let it happen. Whatever is going to happen with the market is going to happen. And so we managed to reduce 30 million bison to fewer than 1,000 in less than 100 years. And
my word.
The states, for their part, I can't remember now if it's Michigan or Wisconsin, one of the upper Midwestern states, passes a state law sometime in the 1880s to try to regulate how passenger pigeons can be killed. What they're trying to do is to keep people from killing them on their nests. But, there's nobody out there really that can enforce a law like that. And whenever people are prosecuted, there was a newspaper editor who was prosecuted under the state law. And of course, the jury acquitted him. He's just going out and killing passenger pigeons on their nest. We're not going to give the guy a fine and give him any kind of prison time for that. So the result is the federal government does nothing. The state governments pass ineffectual laws that are too late. And the result is by 1914, the last passenger pigeon on Earth dies in the Cincinnati Zoo. So this kind of thing, and I could keep going with one species after another, but
exactly,
this is the story of the wildlife of America. It's kind of, my grandparents were still around when passenger pigeons were flying through the skies of Louisiana. And I one time did a calculation. I think I put it in Wild New World of how many years I missed getting to see passenger pigeons by. It was something like about half a century or something. But my grandparents were alive I mean, my grandparents never mentioned having seen them, but they were still, my grandparents were on the scene when these birds were still flying through the skies.
Bison. So, I mean, fur for clothes is self-explanatory, but what are some other species, you mentioned bison, that had market value, and why, or what part was valuable?
Yeah, well, I mean, probably in addition to beaver, and in that case, it was the pelt. For white-tailed deer, it was actually the hide because there was a tremendous need for leather, as particularly during the colonial age when the European nations like England and France and Spain were expanding, creating colonies. There was a tremendous need for leather. And so that's what white-tailed deer were being, I mean, white-tailed deer were slaughtered in unbelievable numbers in early America, to the point where after 4 or 5 years, most new settlements, you couldn't find any deer anymore because people had killed them all, and their hides were being shipped over to Europe to be converted into leather. But probably the animal that produces the biggest ecological effect, sort of the way the extirpation of beaver will do, because when beavers are extirpated across America, it completely changes North American ecologies. North America had been a much wetter, moisture, and greener place when beavers were on streams creating beaver ponds. And when beavers are extirpated, what basically happens is that all of those dams are washed away by spring freshets, and the whole country begins to dry out. I mean, we've got, scholars who have been studying the effect of this on North America. But the other animal that has the same kind of effect, its removal produces a huge kind of ecological chain reaction, was the sea otter. And the sea otter was this 6-foot long otter that frequented the coast from Baja California all the way through the Aleutian Islands. And those sea otters became an early target of fur hunters who basically were going by ship and sailing up and down the Pacific coast, and sometimes paying native people, or sometimes actually kidnapping native people and making them kill sea otters for the fur trade. But those animals were being killed because they had the most extraordinary fur of any animal on earth. In fact, there's a wonderful quote that I use in Wild New World when I'm talking about this, where a sea otter hunter said, except for a human infant and a beautiful woman, the most extraordinary thing on the planet is the pelt of the sea otter. And one of the reasons was that it had evidently 4 or 5 million hairs per square inch in order to keep those otters warm in those frigid Pacific waters. And what sea otters ate were basically sea urchins, which preyed on the kelp beds along the so-called kelp highway from Japan to the Pacific coast of North America. And when sea otters were wiped out, sea urchin populations exploded, and they began wiping out kelp forests. And so a huge component of the immediately offshore ecology of the Pacific was completely altered by, I mean, sea otters were not like passenger pigeons. They were not exterminated totally, but they were wiped out to the point that only about 3 or 4 little remnant populations in hard to reach places survived in order to finally repopulate in the 21st century. But it did have this effect of completely altering the ecology of the Pacific coastline.
My goodness. I mean, when was the turning point in all of this, that because you document it very well in Coyote America with, and I'm sure in your most recent book as well, where this heavy hand that's being used to, with poisons and everything. I mean, you go into great detail about that, and the effects of all of this heavy-handedness, whether it's trade, whether it's extirpation, whatever it is. was there ever a solid recognition that we overdid it? And when does the pendulum start to swing back to try and rectify these wrongs in terms of wildland restoration of species, so on and so forth?
Well, it's primarily the recovery story is primarily a 20th and 21st century story. I mean, back at the beginning of the 20th century, everybody is still kind of reeling, like Ernest Thompson Seton was in writing his story about Tito the Coyote. Everybody is reeling from the losses of all these creatures, and they're trying to grapple with it, and the way America initially grapples with it is through the work of hunters like George Bird Grinnell, a newspaper editor and author who started writing stories about the destruction of American wildlife basically in the 1870s. He became the editor of a new magazine called Forest and Stream and began writing what we would call the first conservation kind of stories about the destruction that was going on. And he and Teddy Roosevelt formed an organization called the Boone and Crockett Club in the 1880s. And what the focus of organizations like the Boone and Crockett Club was, essentially, and the Audubon Society too, and the American Ornithological Society, trying to protect birds because we were wiping out shorebirds like crazy for what was called the plume trade. And the plume trade was, it basically was a fashion trade. Women were wearing the plume feathers, the breeding feathers of birds like snowy egrets on their hats as a fashion statement. And so the Audubon Society and the American Ornithological Society step up in the 1880s to try to put up some sort of regulations on the destruction of these birds on their nests, because that's when the plume feathers were best. I mean, just to tell you this story, and this is one of the most shocking ones that I uncovered in doing all this, in 1 week in the shops in London, the skins of 400,000 American hummingbirds sold as a market product from North America to the old world. Hummingbirds we were killing as a market product. So what the initial focus was by groups like these, Audubon Society, Boone and Crockett Club, is on the animals that we wanted to keep hunting. And so we start setting up what becomes the sort of prototypical state game agency. And so we're going to use our efforts to try to protect deer, and we're going to use our efforts to try to protect elk, and we're going to try to protect waterfowl. And the things that we want to hunt is what we're interested in.
Yeah.
Everything else we don't give a crap about. And so things like the predators, we actively want to get rid of, because if a wolf kills an elk, that means that's an elk that a hunter can't get.
Right.
So that's where we are at the beginning of the 20th century. And what essentially happens, to kind of make this a short story, is that starting in 1916, the science of ecology, the American Ecological Society, has its first meeting, and we start developing this new science of ecology that studies the connections between creatures and their habitats, right out of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if evolution is this important, we need a science to study it. And so ecology begins to emerge in the early 20th century. And ecologists like Aldo Leopold began putting together studies that for the first time are telling us what the connections are between wolf packs, say, and healthy deer and elk herds. I mean, what Leopold is mostly studying in these years is some new phenomenon nobody had ever seen before, called an eruption. And what it is with all the wolves and mountain lions basically killed, what we began to get are these huge population explosions of deer and elk to the point where they eat themselves to the situation of dying of starvation by the tens of thousands, and then starting over and doing it again. These are called eruptions, and Aldo Leopold found evidence of 46 of these eruptions in the early 20th century. So Leopold starts putting us, and people like the Murray brothers, whom I mentioned earlier, start putting us on the track of finally understanding the role. And what Leopold also conveys to us, although we don't have, of course, the genetics yet to be able to demonstrate, or the archaeology or the paleontology to illustrate how ancient these animals are. But Leopold realizes these relationships, say, for example, between wolves and deer, they not only predate Europeans in North America, they predate all humanity in the Americas, probably by, he thinks, millions of years. And he's right. Wolves evolved here 5 million years ago. So what Leopold is beginning to realize is that we've waltzed in here without knowing what the hell we're doing, without knowing anything about ecology or about North America. And we've just decided to kill everything in sight without understanding what the hell we're doing to the place. And so Leopold's arguments began to produce what becomes the ecology movement of the 1960s, and that ultimately produces, finally, the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which, I mean, I wrote an article when the Endangered Species Act was 50 years old 2 years ago. I wrote an article for Time magazine about it that I titled How the Endangered Species Act Saved America, because I think it actually truly did that. And so finally protecting endangered species, designating them, listing them, protecting their habitats, and finally putting together recovery plans like our recovery of wolves in the present day is something that really only dates back 50 years in the past. It's kind of a remarkable thing to think that, but at least we have 50 years of trying to do this.
I mean, it's incredible. It seems like it comes out of nowhere, this amazing shift, this emergence of ecology, all these folks with minds for ecology. I mean, can you identify if anything else happened here in human history that turned us from market hunters to conservationists and ecologists all of a sudden? I mean, there have to be other events or developments in education or just culturally that coincide with this emergence, like you called it, or were these people always there but just without a voice?
Well, there were certainly people always there, and I've tried to, in my book, I've tried to write about those people because they're always the Aldo Leopolds and the Murray brothers and the Teddy Roosevelts. They're always out there, but it's hard for them to get their messages across to a large mass of Americans, in part because in the early 20th century, what became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it's originally known as the Biological Survey, the Bureau of Biological Survey, it has a division that's dedicated to working on behalf of the livestock industry to try to wipe out wolves and coyotes. I mean, it's why we have a law passed in 1931, Animal Damage Control, to exterminate coyotes. Yeah. So at the same time that you have Aldo Leopold trying to teach us about the ancient relationships between wolves and their prey, you also have the Biological Survey putting out these kind of canned articles for newspapers all over the country. I mean, there's a very famous one that was published everywhere in the 1930s that compared animals like mountain lions and bears and wolves and coyotes to the crime desperados of the 1930s and the G-men who are going out and poisoning those animals to the FBI G-men who are bringing in John Dillinger and people like that. Wow. So these people, this bureau is in effect kind of brainwashing the American public into continuing to think that, you know, in the old world tradition, all these animals are really villains that you need to take out as fast as possible. So it takes a while, but to answer your question, Stephen, I think there are two things. One, after the 1920s, America becomes more and more an urban population. And as people are moving away from rural settings, they began to develop a kind of a different attitude about the natural world, one often based more on reading about the natural world than being raised on a farm or a ranch where you're taught by your grandparents that the first thing you do when you see a wolf or a coyote is try to kill it. And so there's a kind of a separation of the urban population after the 1920s from those rural tendencies towards trying to kill predators on sight. And then I think there's the GI Bill after World War II, which enables so many more people to go to college in the 1950s, the 1960s, and 1970s, means you have a much larger segment of the American population that is exposed to new ideas and to the new science of ecology. And that begins to change the whole fabric of America by probably the 1970s. So many people having gone to college begins to produce an observable effect.
Because you've had all this experience, do you see parallels about what's happened historically to what we're sort of seeing now, where we do have, I think personally, there's still this division between ecology and what's right, I guess, for the land and the species, and still sort of this old world thinking that still seems to persist depending upon where you sit. What are some things you can draw on from history that I guess you would say to anyone who's listening here that's struggling with, I guess, those thought processes of seeing, I want to help save X, whatever species it is, I'm hitting a roadblock. What can people look to either in your literature or somewhere else that can point them in a direction to give them some ammunition, knowledge ammunition to help move those thoughts forward?
Well, I do think, and I certainly, this is one of my reasons for writing Coyote America in particular, because I knew that coyotes were expanding across the continent, and many people who had never been exposed to them before were going to be seeing them, and they weren't going to know anything about them. They weren't going to understand the animal. And so I have a pretty strong conviction that understanding and knowing information about these animals, rather than just listening to whatever the conversation might be at at the local beer pub or over watching an NFL game in the afternoon, but actually going to some effort to try to understand these animals, their history, the role they played in the American story. That's, to me, the key to beginning to replace some of these attitudes. And of course, one of the things that you get by understanding those kind of stories is you begin to get a sense of where your own attitudes come from, because they do have origins. They have origins in the kind of history that I've tried to explain here over the last hour or so. So I think information and knowledge is knowledge is power. And there's no question that that's the place to go. It's not easy to change people's minds. There are a lot of people out there, for example, who, they don't want to hear information or evidence or facts. They just want to continue to believe what they've always believed, because they don't want to think that they were ever wrong. They want to think that I had the secret formula all along and everybody else, was in error about this. But it can happen. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience that it can happen, because I've had a significant number of people come up to me after talks that I've done in various places and tell me that reading a book like Coyote America or like Wild New World or American Serengeti had changed their attitudes and had caused them to understand something about the American and wild animal relationship that they had never known before or thought about before. So yeah, I think it's possible to do it. I think it's, we still have a ways to go.
For you, I just have two more things for you, Dan, and really appreciate this deep dive into history and everything else. It's truly fascinating. If you were to give everybody who's listening here something about coyotes, big C coyote, that we haven't sort of touched on, what's something that you would give to them in the current landscape where they're living and moving through these urban settings? What's something you can give to the folks who are listening here about coyotes?
To me, it's a little bit like looking through a good telescope on a clean air night and getting to see the moons, the Galilean moons of Jupiter, and understanding something about the role that those 4 moons around Jupiter played in our scientific view of the world and understanding the world. It's like getting to go off the coast of the big island of Hawaii and get to see whales breach for the first time, or spinner dolphins spinning alongside your boat. What we get to do with coyotes these days is see an actual wild canid, a small wolf, trot through your yard, down the streets of your suburbs, and you don't have to go to Yellowstone to do it. You don't have to go to Alaska to do it. You don't have to go to some wild lands to do it. You get to see this happen in your own setting, right out your kitchen windows, as I have done numerous times here in New Mexico, sitting there and making coffee and look up, and 25 feet away, a coyote is standing there, beautifully silhouetted in morning sunlight. Those erect ears and those yellow eyes focus right on me looking through the window. I mean, and it's a thrill. It does not send my heart into palpitations of fear. It fills me instead, and it should, anybody who gets to see this, with a delight in the marvels of the natural world of North America that we're getting to live these days.
My last question for you, Dan, and I'll keep it to the species we've been talking about. When you hear the word coyote, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
The original national anthem of North America being sung by this animal for 1 million years.
Dan, this has been an absolute pleasure, and trust me, I've been wanting to get more of your books, and this has only made that more clear to get the others. So if you haven't read Coyote America or American Serengeti or any of Dan's stuff, you have to do it. So
good.
Dan Flores, really appreciate your time and the discussion. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, guys. I've enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Hang tight while we sign off. Hal Steele out there. We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.